All right, so here we go. Here's the final part of chapter 27. So this will be part 4. So last time we left off on how protists are able to move. And now we're going to go over how protists reproduce. So protists are able to reproduce asexually and sexually. Okay, so that's different from bacteria and archaea. Bacteria and archaea were only able to reproduce asexually through fission. Okay? So when you reproduce through fission, the daughter cells are identical, right? But with sexual reproduction, which is done through meiosis, the daughter cells are going to be genetically different from the parents and also from each other. So meiosis, it's an adaptive uh, form of reproduction because it results in genetically variable offspring. And this is important because there's a lot of uh, parasites and pathogens that can evolve very quickly because they have short um, generation times. And so natural selection will favor individuals with new genotypes that may be able to resist the parasites or pathogens. So here, by the parasites and pathogens, talking about viruses and bacteria. So haploid versus diploid dominated. So in the life cycle, which describes a sequence of events that occurs as the individuals mature from, a zygote all the way to adulthood. So in meiosis, which is a new event in the protist lifestyle, it created a distinction between the haploid and the diploid phases. Okay, so the haploid having only one set of chromosomes and the diploid having two sets of chromosomes. So bacteria and archaea, these are always haploid. Okay? But in contrast, the life cycle of protists is very variable. So it's variable among different groups of protists. Okay, so if you're talking about an algae life cycle, that'll be different from a plant's life cycle, or different plants, and even within plants, you have different life cycles within that group. So to analyze the life cycle, one way to do it is to start with fertilization. Okay, so that's where the two gametes meet. So gametes meaning sperm and egg. Okay, and so here, so this one, you guys don't have to know this one. So this is an example of a life cycle for a protist called dinoflagellates. But we're gonna stick with just knowing, just to keep it simple, because there's a lot of variation in life cycles. But we're gonna stick with the alternation of generations, like the ones that we learn in lab. Okay. But here I just want to show you, that there is some variety. And here we can see an example of a reproductive cycle from an organism that's unicellular, so a single-celled uh, organism. Okay. So we'll walk through this. All right. So if we start with fertilization, okay, so we have the fusion of gametes. So the fusion of sperm and eggs. For sperm and egg, that forms a zygote. From the zygote, that will turn into a mature cell. That's a haploid. But in order to go from a diploid to a haploid, you're gonna have to go through meiosis. Okay, and then the haploid cell would then have either two roads. So it would either reproduce asexually, or it's gonna produce gametes, which are also haploid. Okay, and then the gametes eventually uh, fuse fuse to and they fertilize. Okay, so this would be an example of a single-celled organism, um, a life cycle of a single-cell organism. Okay. Then we have the alternation of generations. So this happens in multi-cell organisms. So alternation of generations. In one phase, the life cycle is based on the haploid form, and on the other phase, it's based on the diploid form. So the gametophyte is the haploid form, and the sporophyte is the diploid form. The gametophytes are the ones that produce the gametes, and the sporophytes are the ones that produce the spores. So here, this is a life cycle of a brown algae. So it's Ectocarpus. It's a genus Ectocarpus, okay, which is a type of brown algae. So you're going to see that this is very similar to the one we learned for the green algae. Okay. And so if we start with the fertilization down here, so we have the fertilization, we have a zygote that's the diploid. So the zygote eventually it grows. Okay. So then you have the sporophyte, that's the diploid. From the sporophyte, you know that the sporophyte produces spores, right? So through meiosis, the sporophyte produces the spores, and so it could be either male or female. Uh, s- I'm sorry, you have the spores. I got ahead of myself. So we have the spores, and then through mitosis, we get the gametophytes. Okay, the gametophytes are the ones that produce the gametes, which are either male or female gametes. So if they're female gametes, they're eggs. If they're male gametes, then they're sperm. Okay, and then those eventually they'll combine, so they'll fertilize and produce the zygote. Okay, and then the cycle continues. Here it's the same thing. We're looking at alternation of generations from a laminaria, which is another type of brown algae. The only difference between this cycle and this one is that here the haploid and the diploid forms look the same, as you can see. So the gametophyte is a haploid, okay, and the sporophyte is the diploid. But if you look, they look the same. Okay. In this life cycle, for a different type of brown algae, you see that the sporophyte, the diploid, is different than the gametophyte, the haploid. Okay, but everything else is the same. It's just that in this form, there's more That's just another example of the variation that you can see in the life cycle of protists. Okay. But as you can see, if we walk through this, we get the same results. So we have sperm and eggs. There's fertilization, produces a zygote. Okay, and so from the zygote, it develops through mitosis, turns into the sporophyte, which is a diploid, and then the sporophyte through meiosis produces spores. The spores will develop into gametophytes, and then depending on whether they're male or female gametophytes, they'll produce either a sperm or an egg. Okay, and then those, when they combine, it forms a zygote. Okay. So here in the PowerPoint, there's going to be a video that if you want a refresher or you don't quite understand some of the parts, you can play this video and it'll go over the alternation of generations in protists. Okay. All right, so now we're going to go into some of the lineages of eukaryotes. Okay, so there's 7 major eukarya lineages that has at least one distinctive morphological characteristic. And so once an ancestor evolved a distinctive cell structure, its descendants diversified into a wide array of lifestyles. So the first one here is amoebozoa. So amoebozoa, these are organisms that lack cell walls, and these are the ones that can take in food by engulfing it. Okay, so they're the ones that have the pseudopodia. Okay, so pseudopodia are just kind of extensions of the cell. So they kind of look like feet, but they're not feet, so that's why they're called pseudopodia. And these are mainly abundant in freshwater habitats. Yeah. Okay, so here's some of the major subgroups of amoebozoa. Then there's excavata. So these have excavated a feeding groove on one side of the cell. These lack mitochondria. Okay, okay, but some of the ancestors are thought to have mitochondria because some of their genes have a nuclear genome of mitochondrial origin, and some have vestigial mitochondria. So vestigial, that's a way to describe a characteristic that is no longer functioning. So like a vestigial trait. Okay, it could be an organ or a structure that uh, no longer functions the way it originally did. Okay, so for example, like in humans, you have a tailbone, but you don't have a tail. So in that case, that's a vestigial trait of humans that humans have. All right, and so here's some of the major subgroups of the excavata. Okay, then there's the plantae group. So this is a monophyletic group. All the subgroups are descended from a common ancestor that engulfed the cyanobacterium. So remember that the cyanobacterium are the only ones that uh, photosynthesize. And then here's some of the subgroups. So we went over some of these in lab, like the red algae, green algae, and we're going to go over land plants. So just keep in mind that these are not Plantae is not like a phylum, right? So this is it's just think of it as a grouping because we're not going to go over because there's a lot of these are constantly changing, but you can just think of them as a group, okay? A lineage, a group that or a lineage. Okay, then we have Rhizaria. So these are single-celled organisms that lack cell walls, and some of the species have elaborate shell-like coverings. Okay, so like the foraminiferans, actinopods, and what is it? It's rachniophytes. Well, that's a tough name to pronounce. And so these also move by amoeboid motion and produce long, slender pseudopodia. Okay, then we have aviolata, and these have flattened membrane bound vesicles called alveoli, which are located under their plasma membranes. These are unicellular and they're diverse in morphology and lifestyle. And some of these species are capable of uh, bio bioluminescence. Okay? So they're able to glow. So here you can see a picture of dinoflagellates that are of the bioluminescence of dinoflagellates. So usually this happens when you disturb them. And so there was a hypothesis that looked into why these animals glow, And so one hypothesis was the startle hypothesis. And so it looks at ingestion rates by predators. And this suggested that bioluminescence served as a defense mechanism. So they compared two groups of dinoflagellates. There's the dim group, okay, and there's also the bright group. And then on the y-axis, you have the ingestion rate. Okay, so here's a dependent variable, the ingestion rate. And so it did seem like that the dim group, the ones that didn't glow so much, did get ingested more than the bright groups. All right, then we have aviola. Sorry, because these are the examples of the aviolata. And then the last one we're going to look at is Straminopila. Okay, so these, at some stage of the life cycle, have flagella that's covered and distinctive hollow hairs. And this is a synapomorphy of this group. So the lineage includes other unicellular forms, but some are also multicellular. Okay, so we have things like water molds, diatoms, and brown algae. Okay, and here's a picture of them. And so you don't have to worry about all of this other information. For these groups, mainly focus on the information that's provided on these slides. Okay? Because there in the textbook there is a big section where you have a bunch of tables, but just focus on the information that's provided on the slides. Okay. The reason I included this one is because I couldn't get a picture um, from this table, so I wanted to give you guys an idea of what it looks like, but I couldn't separate this picture from the table, so I included all of it. Okay. All right, so that's it. And so this is going to conclude the chapter. Until next time, we'll start a new chapter.